Let me start with you. A serious act, a provocation. In fact, Medvedev, who's under, of course, Vladimir Putin, on the government of Russia, said that this murder is amongst the gravest crimes under international law, and Russia will not let this go unpunished. So, I mean, we've got to be bracing for something next, but what do you suspect it could be?
Well, I think what we're seeing here is the further disintegration of regional security there. I mean, we are seeing Russia acting as a hegemon, and we're also seeing a lot of frustration with that Russian power being played out in the region. Now, this is obviously a really unfortunate outcome, but I think as the United States has retreated from this area, these sorts of tensions are much more predictable.
You know, Steve, to that point, some over there are blaming Western media for too much coverage of Aleppo and the drone footage and the kid coming out of the rubble and that sort of things. I mean, I think it's a cop-out, but where do we fall with respect to what's going to happen over there next, particularly just as Turkey and Russia seem to be healing the rift that came from that downed Russian fighter jet?
Right. You know, listen, Charles, I think the blame always belongs on the assailant, right? Whether, you know, it was recently here at Ohio State.
I guess the question, Steve, let me jump in there. Who is the assailant in this case?
Well, the assailant, I don't know his name, to be frank, but he's a Turk policeman who killed the Russian ambassador. But I guess here's the bigger point, I think, and the point that I think is relevant for Americans, and as an alum of the Trump campaign. We were assailed throughout the campaign that we were somehow a puppet of the Kremlin, which is, of course, ridiculous. The left continually tried to, and still tries to act as though we had some sort of bat phone to Putin, and we were taking electoral advice from that. That's ridiculous. At the same time, I think it is important to note that Russia and the United States, while we are mostly adversaries, there are places and times when we can very much work cooperatively, and I think the foremost of those is the defeat of ISIS. And I think this is emblematic of the common battle that both Russia and the United States do have against Islamist terrorism, and we saw it in its ugly face rear itself today, both in Berlin and in Ankara, and that is one place where the Kremlin and the United States actually have a common goal.
You know, though, here's the thing, Noelle. It would seem that this police officer was sympathetic to ISIS, perhaps referring to the destruction of ISIS by the West. And Turkey, I think also, obviously, you know, they've lost in the last couple of weeks in Syria just as much as the U.S.-backed rebels and ISIS have. So this is a powder keg ready to happen. And let's not forget about all the human rights and the counter-coup that's gone on since Erdogan was able to stay in power.
Yeah, and you know, you've got to look at the way this was done. This is a despicable way, cowardly way this was done. He was shot from the back. He was shot from someone that had, you know, a couple of years in the military or in the security sector. But you've got to look. What I want to see is what's going to be coming with the information. What group exactly was he affiliated with? You know, when you yell Al Akbar, I mean, you could do Al Qaeda, ISIS, the list goes on. But I think that this is a cry to defeat radical Islam all the way, globally, all the way, because it's not just this one group. It's not ISIS, not Al Qaeda. There are millions, and once you cut off the head of the snake, it's what they talk about all the time, there are going to be more and more and more groups that come. So it's going to have to be a continuing program for all the nations to have to look at to stop this.
I mean, Jillian, you certainly can tie this. Perhaps, I'm pretty sure we'll be able to tie this in the Berlin, not necessarily as being coordinated from the same place, but by the same sort of, you know, the same sort of sympathetic movement and instructions, whether it's Al Qaeda, whether it's ISIS. And it does, to me, it seemed like it could ultimately unite the West in its fight to finally have the right determination to destroy this enemy, this common enemy, once and for all.
Look, there's a lot we don't know about what happened today, and I think as details come out, that's going to be very insightful. You know, we're not just looking in Turkey at Islamist groups. We're also looking at radical Kurdish groups, and they're very different than the Kurds that are fighting ISIS. We've seen them carrying out terror attacks there. So I think there's an open possibility of what the significance of this is. But I do want to say, to Steve's point about Russian cooperation, if you want to see what teaming up with Putin looks like, look in Syria right now. Look at Aleppo being slaughtered. That's not the kind of guy that we want to be, cooperating necessarily with in our foreign policy. I think he's created a lot of regional evil, and that's something that's just absolutely tragic.
Okay, but hold on. To that point, I mean, I have a right to respond to that. To that point, we teamed up with his predecessor, several generations back, Joseph Stalin, who was a horrible man, far worse than Putin, and I have no illusions about Putin. But we teamed up with Stalin when we had a common enemy that was more important at the time for us to defeat together. So the idea that we can never ally ourselves temporarily with people we find disreputable, I think that's
not what I'm arguing.
That's a naive approach to foreign policy.
But when Trump says that this is somebody he can see being friends with, this man is not our friend. This is an evil man. And sometimes you do need to do foreign policy with those kind of people. But I think in that region,
sometimes you do. When the other side may be even more evil and more propose an even greater threat. Guys, I'd love to keep going on, but we can't. I appreciate it. We'll certainly have to, unfortunately, cover this more often.